Okay, that little counter didn't work. I keep trying to get that counter and count this down and make it live, but for some reason I can't figure it out. I haven't been able to go live for very long. I had to get 1,000 subscribers to do that.
Yeah.
So let's see. Anybody in here? I don't know if it's okay to use your last name. I already did in the title.
Yeah, I don't mind. I mean, I hadn't been on podcasts, and then when I started working with Doug and did his show, he said, he wanted me to speak at a conference that's going on in Wisconsin. And I said, once you start doing that in person, you ain't gonna. Plus, I'm like I say, I mean, I share pretty openly now that, at 53 years old, reaching the point I have with business and my, professional life, that I've just kind of reached a point where I really don't give a crap anymore. I mean,
now, when you say Doug, we're talking about Doug Hajicek. What's your relationship to him?
So he's a research partner of mine. He lives in Minnesota, not far from me. And once he had heard about my encounter, which I shouldn't say he heard, I shared my encounter in an email with him. One of the first people I'd really professionally, out openly that I had talked about it. And, other than just a couple hunting buddies, and he had originally heard about some research that I was doing here in Minnesota. So he asked me, well, how'd you get into research? And I shared my whole encounter with him. And he said, you're like one of only 2 or 3 people that I know that have physically been attacked like that by Bigfoot.
Yeah, that's what makes the story so compelling.
Yeah. And I wrestled with, like I say, for 30 years of my life. I mean, the first 30 years after this happened, when I was 18 years old, I really felt like I couldn't tell anybody about it. I mean, I've been married now for 23 years, and I just told my wife about it here a couple of years ago.
Wow.
So, and I had told a couple of my close hunting guide friends that I guide with. And, it's kind of what I expected. I mean, like Doug says, some people will say they believe you, but you really wonder if they really do. And I just kind of accepted that, everybody's got a different threshold of proof that they require before they believe in something, whether it's Bigfoot or not, and they're the ones who decide when they've reached that point. That burden isn't mine. I mean, right. If I share what my encounter with you and tell you what happened to me when I was 18 years old, that might be compelling to some people, and to some people they might believe it or not believe it. But that burden of whether or not you believe it, that isn't mine to worry about. I mean, and it took a long time to get to that point. I think that's why a lot of people have, if you go on the BFRO encounters, there's probably 3,000 encounters in their registry. And then there's other spots that have registered encounters. And I think that number's probably times 100 for people who have actually had encounters. But, that feeling that they're on trial, so to speak, when they share it, keeps them from doing it. They fear the judgment of others and everything that comes with that,
Well, there's like about five encounters in my county in the BFRO website, and I know of another 5 just myself that didn't make it on there. So that just and that's just me. God knows how many's out there.
Yeah, I think up in the area that I research up in northern Minnesota, there are, almost every week somebody's saying something about, hey, somebody saw this. I just read a report here just the other night, 3 nights ago, that on the Minnesota group that does a lot of research up there, that a trucker was driving along and had a 9-foot tall, dark, Bigfoot. Look, he figured it was a Bigfoot because it was on its hind legs from the tree line on the left side of the road all the way to the tree line on the right side of the road. And it crossed about a 70 or 80 foot path coming across that road of open ground right in front of him. And, it's an area where there's a lot of sightings. But, that guy had mentioned it to somebody who mentioned it, and it gets put in this local Facebook page. Will it ever make it to BFRO's deal? I don't know. I think there's a lot of things like that happen and I think there's some remorse too, that somebody has an encounter, they share it with one or two people, and as soon as they get some negative feedback, boom, they are never going to tell anybody else about it again. So I think that probably attributes to a lot of these too that just don't get reported.
Also, the BFRO get a lot of hate. So a lot of people.
Yeah, every organization does, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I mean, I learned a long time ago in real estate that, you're going to have fans and you're going to have haters, and it doesn't matter how good you are at what you do. That's just the way the world spins. And that, any organization that gets big, they've got people that are recognizable within that organization. And, it's not the organization itself that probably has the negative connotation that gets thrown their way sometimes. Because I think there's some people within that organization that have pretty good reputations within the industry. And then there's some that don't. Right. But yet they're all wearing the same hat. So, the organization will suffer as a whole in some people's eyes.
Okay. So now that we have a few people in here, I think we got 11 so far. That's big for me. Do you want to go into the way back machine and start from the start with your amazing encounter?
Sure. So this happened in the first week of June in 1987. I was 18 years old, just graduated from high school. And a friend of mine, I had joined the Army. And I didn't leave for the Army until the end of July. So, I had half of a summer to fit a whole summer into basically before I left. And I grew up in the outdoors. My dad was a hunting and fishing guide. Was from South Dakota, but we had a place up in northern Minnesota where we went, and we hunted in Montana and Wyoming and in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. I mean, even at 15, 16 years old, I had been around bears and had big game experience. So when I was 18, one of my friends from school, we had just graduated, and he said, I'm going fishing with my dad and my brother and two of my uncles and a handful of his cousins that were in their upper 20s or so, up in Manitoba, and wanted to know if I wanted to join them. And, I said, sure. So we went up there, and it was quite a drive. It was about 30 hours from where we were at in South Dakota. Whoa. It took a couple of days to get there because it wasn't so much as the crow flies it took so long. It's once we got to Flin Flon, which is, for those that aren't familiar, it's a city that's kind of on the border of Saskatchewan and Manitoba, big logging community. And once you go north of there, it's like tank trails, it's not even really maintained roads. And we went another 110 or so miles north of there into the Churchill River system, which is a bunch of different big lakes that are connected. And there was one lake that was pretty large that my friend's dad had hunted at before. And there was three Intuit guides that ran a camp there, pretty primitive camp. And primarily hunting, but they took some fishermen in. And so we went up there, 10 of us total, to go fish. And we were going to be there fishing for 8 days. Now, me and my friend, who was the same age as I at the time, 18, his little brother, who was 14, the three of us were always in a boat every day. I mean, our parents kind of trusted us with that kind of stuff. We grew up in the outdoors. So the first 3 days were pretty like little adventures. We'd go a few hours away from the guide camp, but not too far. There was a dozen islands on this lake, and there was really no reference points as far as the shoreline goes. It's all heavily wooded. I mean, there were no like cabins really around. In fact, the first 3 days we were there, we never saw any other boats on the lake other than the people that were with our party, But each day we ventured out a little bit further. And on the fourth day, we were heading north on the lake. We'd gone quite a ways. We were on the back side of a couple islands where you couldn't even see the guide camp. And this was back before GPS and stuff. We had a little paper map in the boat that had kind of a contour line of the depths of different areas on the lake. And some of the bigger islands were named. Some of the smaller ones weren't. My buddy was running the motor, 16-foot Lund aluminum boat, with a tiller, 25 horse tiller on it. And his 14-year-old brother said he had to go pee. He was one of these guys that doesn't seem to be able to pee out of a boat very easily.
I know people like that.
Yeah. So we pulled up on the shore of this little island. And this island was probably about 25 acres, 30 acres in size. And it had some topographically, it was a hump. I mean, the middle of this island probably sat 40, 50 feet above the lake. And it was heavily treed. I mean, pines, poplars, birch. We pulled up on there was a stretch of gravel beach that looked like it went around the whole half of the island we were looking at. We didn't have to search for a good spot to pull up. We just pulled up because the whole beach was just gravel. And we got on the shore, pulled the boat up a little bit, and those guys were both taking a leak. And I was looking at the edge of the tree line. This, from the water's edge of the tree line, is probably 25, 30 foot. And there was a really heavily worn down game trail that went up this hill up into the island. And it was heavily wooded. When I stood at the beach and looked up, it's probably 4 or 5 foot wide. But as I looked up, it's probably a 30-degree incline. So you couldn't see a long ways up it. You'd see probably 15, 20 feet. And then you'd have to walk that distance to see that far again, The tree canopy and the dense, there was a lot of cedar scrubs growing around the edges of it. But I told those guys, I'm going to walk up this trail real quick. And I started walking up it. And of course I had tennis shoes on, and you'd take 3, 4 steps and then slide back a step or two. I mean, it had rained that morning, and it was actually still a little drizzly out. And, so this trail was kind of greasy. It was pine needles and compacted dirt, and I struggled to walk up it, but I just kept making my way up it until I was ways away from the beach up this hill. And I was still going up an incline. It was pretty steep. And as I'm walking up, I heard this loud crack. I mean, it was like you'd hit a snare drum almost, like right close to you. I knew that whatever broke this log was probably within 50 feet of me. That's how loud and how close it was. And there was no wind. I mean, down at the water was smooth as glass. So, I mean, that with that wet air, I mean, it just reverberated through the air when this thing cracked. And I could hear those guys yell, "What was that?" And I'm standing still looking off the trail to my left because I really felt like a black bear had made that sound. I mean, it was something that had weight to it. It must have stepped on a wet log or something, There's a lot of deadfall timber on the forest floor. And so I stood real still for, when I say 2 minutes, it doesn't sound that long, but that's a long time just to stand there staring, because I didn't want to retreat and go down this hill till I had located what I assumed was a bear. So I was just really watching closely into the dead fallen timber and the brush and cedar scrubs, and I could not pick up any movement. And it was just the more I stood there, the more kind of bewildered I became because I knew how close this was. And so I looked down at the beach because I really kind of felt like I'd been there so long. Maybe they're starting to walk up the trail towards me. So I looked down the trail and I don't see anybody coming up the trail yet. And as I turned around and looked up the trail, this thing's standing right in front of me. I mean, 15 feet away from me.
Whoa.
And the elevation, like I say, this is probably about a 30-degree incline going up it. So this thing was standing on ground probably 2 foot tall, higher than the ground I was standing on. So when I turned around, I'm looking right at its knees. And at first, I mean, just instant registry was I was looking at a really big bear that was standing on its hind legs. That's just what I assumed. And I didn't want to panic. I didn't want to run. I probably stood there and stared at its knees for 3 or 4 seconds before I started looking up its body. And as I looked up at waist level, I see 2 big hands cradling underneath like this at its waist, a section of cedar log that was about 6 inches in diameter, and it was about 5 to 6 foot long. And on the left side of it, it had a root ball that was pretty decent size of dirt and roots just on this log. And it was just holding it right close to its body with its hands cradled under it. And as I looked up its body, I mean, the first thing I realized, I knew I wasn't looking at a bear because this thing, a bear will almost go skinny at the hips, wide in the body, and narrow out as you get towards the head again. This thing was just stupid wide at the legs. It was wide at the hips. It was wide at the waist. It was wide at the chest. I mean, it was just like this massive thing standing on its hind legs right at me while its hands are underneath this log. And when I looked up at its face, I mean, I only got to see its face for, maybe a second. And as soon as I looked at its eyes, it shucked this log away from its body at me, and it hit me right at the hips, right in my stomach and my hips, and launched me off my feet. So not only was I gonna fly backwards and land on my back, but it's pretty steep downhill. So I mean, I was in the air for what felt like quite a while, and I'm looking at it as I'm flying backwards. And when I hit the ground, it kind of half knocked the wind out of me. And I'm just sliding like a wet slide at a swimming pool. I mean, it just sliding down this greasy trail with this log. I was trying to roll over onto my stomach because I'm going head first downhill on my back. And my first instinct was just to get to my feet and run like hell, And I was trying to spin over onto my stomach as I'm sliding down. When I was looking up at the trail right before I lost sight of it, I couldn't see its head anymore. But as I was sliding down, I watched its feet as it jumped in the air twice, just like if you were going to stomp your foot twice, but it did it with both feet. I mean, it like hopped twice real hard. And it felt like if I walked up and just pushed you in the back twice, I could feel it in the ground when it was jumping. It was probably 30 feet away from me, 25 foot away from me at that point. And I slid all the way down to the beach area. And in sliding down, that log was pinned under my left arm, and then my right leg was like draped over it because, like I say, I was trying to turn over to my stomach. And so my left ankle got pinned under the log, and I had sprained it pretty badly. As soon as I realized I was at the gravel, I jumped up to my feet, and those guys are my friend and his brother are just freaking out. They're like, I think they thought that I had gotten attacked by a bear, because right. I mean, I just, I show up just full blown panic mode, and I'm yelling, get in the boat, get in the boat. Those guys are both running for the boat. I was ready to run for the boat, and that's when I realized my left ankle was really badly sprained. So Jamie, my friend's little brother, Jamie, he jumps in the boat, and he gets back by the motor, and my friend Paul, he pushes the boat into the water, and he's standing there in probably a foot of water, holding the nose of the boat, waiting for Jamie to get this motor started. And I wanted to run to the boat, but like I say, not only was my ankle sprained, but I just had this overwhelming fear, like if I turned my back on that game trail, that this thing was going to come running out and tackle me from behind. I mean, I felt like it was right behind me still, even though I never saw it pursue me. I guess
you're running backwards then, basically.
Well, sidestepping and backwards. I mean, I didn't want to just go backwards and fall over, so I was trying to go backwards while I'm looking over my left shoulder at the boat. So I'm kind of sidestepping, and then I'd take a couple steps back and sidestep again, but I just couldn't stop looking at the game trail most of that time. When I got to where the boat was, I walked into the water and just threw myself over the gunwale of the boat into the middle of the boat, sat up on the bench seat, and Jamie's just pulling this motor, boom, boom, boom. And, you know, in retrospect, I don't know if Jamie had ever really started a boat motor before. I mean, Paul had been running it the whole time, and Jamie was his younger brother. I don't know if it was flooded, if he didn't have the choke on, or maybe he did, or whatever, but it obviously was flooded and wouldn't start. And I just was staring at that tree line the whole time, thinking this thing's coming. And Paul's just yelling at Jamie, "You've got to get this thing started." And that's when I realized these guys, we can't just keep sitting here, right? So I started yelling at Jamie, get the damn motor started, Jamie. And I was yelling at Paul, just get in the boat, right? And so Paul, he jumps in the boat, just right over the nose of the boat, pulls his body weight up and jumps in, flies past me on the center seat, tells Jamie to go up into the front. So Jamie comes past me and goes up in the front, and Paul gets back on the motor and starts starting it. And it wasn't starting right away. And Jamie, that's when I realized that Jamie was, he was crying. He was, like I say, he was 14. And when I share the rest of this account, you got to kind of keep that in mind as far as how he reacted to all of this, because, I've got two boys that are 16 and 17 right now. And, not all 14-year-olds are at the same point in maturity, Even my own boys, when I think about them a few years ago at 14, just getting done with junior high school and getting ready to go into high school, where they were then and where they're at now, there's a lot of maturity that's occurred as they're becoming young men,
Yeah, they're totally different.
Yeah. And so, as devastating this was to me as this was happening, I was really in shock, but Jamie was just in a panic mode. I mean, like, he was crying, he could barely speak.
Now, had they seen this from their vantage point?
They hadn't seen it yet, but they knew that when I was running at the boat, I was screaming, get in the effing boat now. And I think, like I say, I think they thought that I had been attacked by a bear, or that, they knew that something threw me down that trail.
Right.
They knew that I didn't run down it. They saw me come flying down on my back onto the beach, holding a log. And I just was yelling, get in the boat. This whole time, I'm going down a mental checklist in my head, not of what this could have been, but what it wasn't. I was convincing myself this wasn't a black bear. This wasn't a grizzly. This wasn't a person. We are so far off the grid here. Like I said, we hadn't even seen other boats. This is a small island. There's no way this is a person. And I know how big it was. When I stood there and looked up at it, it was like standing underneath a basketball hoop, staring up right at the hoop from directly underneath of it just to see its face. And so I looked down the shoreline to our left because I noticed something come running out of the trees, and immediately I thought it was this thing because it was black, but I realized it wasn't. It was a black bear came running out of the trees about 70 or 80 yards down the shoreline. And this thing something had freaked this thing out. I don't know if it had witnessed what had happened to me and seen this thing when it did to me, or if it's just aware that this thing's on the island that it's on. I assume they're aware of each other. But this bear starts coming down the beach towards us, but it doesn't even know we're there yet because it's not looking forward as it's walking. It's looking over its left shoulder at the tree line. And it just keeps getting closer and closer, walking pretty steadily at us. And at some point, about halfway to us, it looks up and sees us, and it actually it picked up the pace coming at us. Not like it's like in a threatening way. It almost looked like it was relieved to see humans there, you know. I mean, it wasn't apprehensive. It was jogging towards us. And Jamie starts screaming, "There's a bear, there's a bear." And I said, "Jamie," I said, "just take," I was like, "Don't freak out, Jamie." I said, "Grab the stringer," because we had caught some northerns that morning, northern pike, and we had a couple of them on a stringer hanging right over the side of the front of the boat where Jamie was. And he pulled the stringer in, and I told him, "Take a fish off the stringer." And he took it off the stringer, and I said, "Throw it on shore." And he threw it up on shore. But as this bear walks, because the front of our boat's literally less than 20 feet from the water's edge. We aren't blowing anywhere. There's still. We aren't drifting out. We're just sitting there dead in the water. And this bear walks up to this fish, and it's missing its right paw. And I thought maybe that it had, it wasn't a fresh injury. I thought maybe it got caught in a trap when it was younger. I mean, it wasn't a mature bear anyways. It was a 2-year-old bear, probably barely 300 pounds. But it picked this fish up with its good paw and had it pinned against its wrist, and it bit the head off this fish, and in 3 bites swallowed it. And it looks over behind it at this tree line and is standing there. And it drops this fish and takes off sprinting back down the beach in the direction it came from. And I honestly didn't know a bear could move that fast. I mean, this thing was probably running 25, 30 mile an hour down that beach. And that's when I realized that this thing's still here, that this bear is running from it, that it's got to be right inside this tree line. And I started yelling at Paul. I said, "Get the frickin' motor started." And he did. I don't know if it was a matter of that it didn't have fuel pressure and he pumped up the ball or whatever, but he got it started and puts it in reverse, and we start backing away from the beach. And we backed up till we were 80 to 100 yards away from the edge of the beach. And for the first time, I was starting to feel like this adrenaline dump was starting to subside a little bit, like I'm still trying to process what I had just experienced and what had just thrown this log at me. These guys weren't aware of what I was aware of, but I am looking at the tree line, and I watch this thing walk right out onto the beach. And Paul saw it as it walked out. Jamie was sitting in the front of the boat with his back to us. And Paul says, "What the F is that?" And he starts kind of freaking out. And Paul's really a calm person. I mean, he's always been the one that he'd find the humor in something, sarcastic, dry humor. He didn't really get excited about a lot of stuff. But that's when he started hitting his panic button. And he says, "What is this, Jeff? What is that?" And he says, "Is that what attacked you on that trail?" And I said, "Yeah." I said, "It's not a bear. It's not a bear." And Jamie's crying so hard now that, I mean, he's just literally just like wailing, crying, because some people, when they go into shock, I think they just get quiet, they kind of freeze up, but Jamie just couldn't collect himself of this. It was really traumatic for him to be going through this. And this thing walks out onto the beach, walks up to that fish and picks it up. It's missing a head, but he stands there and holds it in front of his body like this, and is just staring at us for probably 15, 20 seconds. Just stood there staring. And 80 to 100 yards away, you could see that. I mean, it was cloudy. It wasn't like there was sunlight or glare. I mean, you could see it plain as day. And it just, after about 20 seconds staring at us, it turned around and walked right back into that tree line and was gone. And so I told Paul, I says, "We got to get out of here. Just go back to the guide camp, And so Paul opens up the motor and we start taking off. And the whole time I'm just, I just kept telling Jamie, I says, "It's all right. Just, I'm just trying to get him to relax," mostly because the sound that he was making was only making my stress worse, to be honest with you. I mean, I don't mean to sound mean about it, but I'm trying to reason what's just happened here, and all I'm hearing is Jamie just coming undone. And so I just kept telling him, "Relax, Jamie, it's going to be all right. We're safe, we're safe." And Paul, about halfway back to the guide camp, I mean, we were a ways away. We were a long ways away, to be honest with you. We were probably like 9 miles, 10 miles up the lake from the guide camp. About halfway there, Paul stops the boat, and we're just sitting there floating, and he turns the motor off and he says, "What are we going to do?" And he says, "What?" And we started talking about what just happened. And Paul says, "Was that a Bigfoot?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "Are you freaking kidding me? There's no way, And we grew up, like I said, we grew up in South Dakota. Okay. It's flat land there, right? We all had experience hunting, and, we're way off the grid in Montana, Wyoming. We vacationed in northern Minnesota and Canada. But I mean, we didn't grow up with a lot of these encounters that you hear from people. They say, "Oh, my uncles talked about this, that," we never had any friends or relatives that said, "Oh, your Uncle Bob's cousin was, saw one." Or there was no secondhand stories of this where we grew up. All we knew was what the myth was that people talked about, what they think Bigfoot is, and the Patterson film and stuff like that, right? There was really no intimate knowledge of, as much as we'd been in the outdoors, there was no talk of it when we were there. So for us to be knowing what we saw, and we know that it wasn't a bear. I mean, I knew it wasn't a bear before I got off the trail, before this thing threw this at me. But for Paul and Jamie, even, we just got done watching a bear for 3 minutes on the beach, walk right up to our boat. We knew that when this thing stepped on the beach, it wasn't a bear. This thing was about 10 foot tall. I know, just for size reference, that if I ran full blast, jumped as high as I couldn't have touched this thing on its head. That's how tall it was.
So Joe's asking, yeah, I was going to ask the same question myself. Joe was saying, did you get enough of a look at the face to describe it?
Yeah. So it's first of all, I only got to see its face for literally 1 second. I mean, I probably spent 6 or 7 seconds. This thing stood still in front of me. As I looked, turned around, seen its legs, looked up at its hands and the log, and seen the chest and the head. And it was when I looked at its eyes that at that moment it threw this log at me. But I remember everything that I saw just like it's like it's just ingrained there. I'll never, until the day I die, I'll never forget exactly what it looked like. So I don't have much of a hard time recounting details of what I saw. It's so close. So its face, it had a defined brow, but it's I would say that its eyes looked human. They're sunk in more, but looked human. Its head was more than twice as big as my head. So when I say, well, it had a huge nose, well, I mean, compared to mine, it had a huge nose, but in proportion to its head, it's probably no different than mine was. But its nose was a little flatter, and it was turned up, but it wasn't ape-like. I mean, when you see a picture of an ape, you see this really flat nose, and it's like the nostrils don't aim down, they aim forward, right? And the nostrils are like the size of like golf balls. It wasn't like that. This thing had a human element to its nose. It was flatter than mine. It was a little wider than mine, but the nostrils aimed like maybe 30 degrees, but primarily down, not straight out. Its top lip was tight to its teeth. Like if you were like, if you were to grin like that, how kind of defined and flex kind of your top lip is against teeth. It was like that. But its bottom lip, its mouth was open like this, and its lip just lazily hung forward. And that's it had the same expression from the second I saw it, even as when I was sliding down the trail and looked back up at it, it still looked the same. I wouldn't describe it as menacing or, ticked off or anything like that. It just
blank,
just looked serious, and its skin was like a chalky black, like dried dirt color, didn't have a sheen to it. Didn't have any glare to it. I mean, it was just like chalk, like matte black. Could see around its eyes, could see its nose, its lip, down around the sides of its mouth. But I mean, there was hair on the cheeks. There was hair, even coming down to the eyes. It's as far as its body, it looked like when you see these professional wrestlers or football players that are like the ones that are really big, how they don't look like they have a neck. It's like they're from their shoulder to their ear looks like one big, huge muscle. That's what it looked like. I'm sure it had a like defined clavicle area, but I mean, I was so overcome by the mass and the width that I really didn't notice much. I mean, even when I was looking at its stomach and chest, as I looked up at what stood out was how wide it was and how massive it was. I wasn't looking at, can you see skin through the hair and things like that. It was dark, like if you open up a dark chocolate Hershey's candy bar, that's what color the hair was primarily. It almost looks black, but it's really just deep, deep brown. But I would estimate that, and I say this with some experience bear hunting and stuff, and I watch a lot of videos of this Billy Moles who guides grizzly hunters up in Alaska, that at 10 foot tall, seeing the mass of this thing, I would estimate that it weighed probably around 1,200 pounds or more.
Wow.
When I looked at it, when I turned at it, I was looking straight at its knees. And as I started looking up, the first thing that just blew me away was that its thighs were like 2 5-gallon buckets sitting next to each other. That's the diameter of its thighs. And it just, I mean, that's why when I turn around, because of the color of the hair, I just immediately thought, oh, she's like bear, right? And I got panicked. But as I started looking up, I mean, as soon as I seen its hands, I could see like this much of its hands, just that much as it wrapped around the bottom of the log with both of its hands. And just the way it was holding the log, I knew this isn't a bear. This is, and the next thing I'm thinking is it's a person. And as I'm looking up it, I just realized that it's not a person either. So, and the way it threw this log at me was like, I've described it to other people. It's like if I was to pass a basketball from you, it doesn't take a lot of effort. You don't wind it up behind your back or anything. It's just, you just kind of push it forward from my chest to your chest. That's kind of how it shucked this log at me. I mean, it looked effortless the way that it threw this thing. I could hear it exhale. It was like, as it did it. And it happened without warning. I mean, it was like a bomb going off when it threw this thing and hit me. But the force it hit me with, for not like looking like it took a lot of effort to throw it, was just ridiculous. I mean, it hit me really hard. It immediately, I was just launched. So when we were out in the boat, I told Paul, I said, after we'd talked about it for almost a half an hour, maybe longer than that. Jamie was starting to calm down a little bit, and I was really getting a lot calmer. I mean, the adrenaline was just kind of subsiding, but I just got to a point where I didn't want to talk about it anymore because, what I really wanted was answers, and neither of them were going to give me any answers as they explain what had just occurred. And I think they both felt the same. Like, after talking about, I told them exactly what I've shared with you guys here now. Just that's what I told them in the boat for half an hour, what it looked like, what it did. And after everybody's on the same page of what had happened to me on the trail, we didn't really have anything else to say other than just these giant question marks that none of us were able to answer. And so I told Paul, I said, let's go back to the camp. I said, we should tell your dad what happened. And Paul said, I'm not telling anybody. And at first that didn't make a lot of sense to me. I felt like we needed to tell somebody, but Paul said, listen, he says, we're the youngest ones here. We're 3 kids, and we got my dad and 2 uncles and a bunch of 20-something cousins, and they're going to make fun of us. Nobody's going to believe us. We're going to be here fishing for 4 more days. We're going to be the butt of every joke. I mean, it's just, he says, I don't want to tell anybody. And I just felt like, the more I thought about it, I think maybe I just felt like, gosh, maybe you're right. I don't want to be 4 days of being the idiot who nobody believes, right? Especially around a bunch of adults, in this camp. So we went back to the dock at the guide camp, and everybody was there. That was kind of the MO. We'd take off fishing 7 or so, 8 in the morning, fish till 2 or 3 in the afternoon, come back. We'd hang around for a couple hours, then go out and fish just for a little bit before dark, just somewhere close. And when we got back, all of his relatives were all on the docks. There's 2 docks next to each other, and these 3 guides were on the dock. And we got out of the boat, and we weren't saying anything. And I think that was strange to them, probably in retrospect, because, for 3 days, we're the kids. We'd get out of the boat and tell war stories about how we caught this and did that. We're trying to look like the big, like we're just as good as these adults are, right? And we weren't saying really anything. I know we were all 3 still just really traumatically still in shock. And so everybody eventually, after a few minutes, left the dock and went up to this campfire area where we usually had meals and stuff. And I was just on the dock staring out at the water, just like, just bewildered still. And I realized at that point that my ankle didn't hurt at all. I mean, my pain scale was 0 on 0 to 10. It's like it never happened, which was really strange to me because I knew that it was significantly injured when I was on the beach. I mean, I couldn't put half my weight on it. And as I'm standing there, one of these, the oldest of these three guides, like I say, they were Inuit guides. They were locals who grew up in that area, and they're in that camp 365 days a year. They live there, you know. He walked down the dock and said, "Are you okay?" And I thought that was odd because I thought I was doing a pretty good job at hiding how I felt, you know, what had happened. And I said, I figured, you know, if Paul doesn't want to tell his dad and stuff, fine. But, you know, I needed to kind of unload something here. And I said, "No, I'm not." And he goes, "What happened?" He says, "Did you get in an argument with your friends?" Which I guess that's what you'd assume would happen, right? Mm-hmm. But I told him, I said, "No," I says, "It's something happened to us out there today." I told him we were way on the north end of the lake and we pulled up on an island and something happened and I still can't. I'm just trying to figure this all out right now. I know what happened, but it doesn't make sense to me. And he said, "You mind if I ask what island it was?" And this island was close to an island called Patton Island. But this little island didn't have a name on the map. And rather than try to describe where I thought this island was, I just told them we were on Patton Island. Patton Island was to the east of this island. It was to the southeast of this island. And he said, "Is it, was it something traumatic or was it, you know, are you okay? Did you get injured?" And I said, "No, I feel all right now, but something attacked me." And that's when it's like, I felt like this guy was just reading me like a freaking fortune teller. I mean, first of all, for him to even walk up to me when I'm not even sure if I knew what his name was at that point, right? And he says, "Let me show you something." And he brings me over to this old shed that's beside, not too far from the water's edge. It's a shed that they keep boat motors and stuff in. It looked like it was about 100 years old. And on the back side of the shed, there's an aluminum boat laying upside down on the ground with a tarp over it. And he says, "I want you to look at this." And he pulls the tarp off. And this boat, the whole starboard side of this boat is completely caved in. It looked like if you parked the boat in the middle of a highway and you ran into the side of it with a motorcycle doing 60 miles an hour. That's the size of the way this thing was caved in. I mean, 2/3 the length of the boat was just bashed in on it. And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "Well, last fall, I was guiding a moose hunter and he shot a moose on a small island. And we went up and took pictures of him with it. And I brought him back to camp. And then I went back out to skin it and quarter it out and bring it back." And he said, "When I was there, I had it all skinned. And I had an encounter. And it lasted over an hour." He said, "I was carried a hind quarter and put it in the boat. And as I put it in the boat, I started walking back for the other one. And," he says, "something came out of the tree line and was growling." And he says, "It chased me." He said, "I ran partway down the beach and circled back, like running at the boat. He jumped in the boat. His weapon was in the boat, but he had unloaded it. And he jumped in the boat and kind of for like, just like placing something between you and it. And he said this thing ran up to the side of the boat and started with its knee, just started smashing its knee over and over in the side of this boat, caving it in. And he said after it struck it 7 or 8 times, it grabbed this hind quarter that he had placed in the boat, threw it up over its shoulder, and walked back into the trees. And he got on a 2-way radio and called these 2 guides that he works with and was freaking out saying, "You got to get out here. Help me, help me." And he said I had to wait about a half an hour for him to show up, but the whole time he was waiting, this thing was in the tree line growling and screaming at him. And he said it just took forever for those guys to get there.
And he couldn't move with the boat because it was all caved in?
He couldn't do anything with the boat.
Oh, my God.
And so these guys showed up, and as they showed up, the last few minutes before they showed up, he kind of felt like, look, if I tell them what happened, they're not going to believe me either, right? And so he told them that a cow moose had charged him, and he jumped in the boat, and it rammed the side of the boat, which is feasible. I mean, I've heard of hunters that will, cow moose will stay with its calves for like 3 years before they separate. And, if you shoot, I think that's one of the reasons why they've made these rules that a bull moose has to be so big before you can shoot it, 50 some inch spread, whatever, because of the fact that if you shoot one that's fairly immature, its mom's there, and they're dangerous animals. So I get where maybe he thought they'd believe that, because he was really afraid to tell them what had happened. He didn't think they'd believe him. But as they were loading up these quarters, he said they noticed then that I was missing a hind quarter. And he says, so I told them the truth of what happened. And I said, what did they say? And he says, I'm just going to tell you right now. He says, if I was you, I would try to acclimate yourself to where you were at this morning prior to this happening, and try to enjoy your next 4 days. He says, nothing good is going to come of telling people about this, because unless they've been there, they're not going to believe you. And I never told Paul about what the guide said to me. Paul and Jamie had made this pact. They weren't going to tell anybody. So I see Paul still. We aren't real close, but I still see him about once every year. And about 3 years ago, I seen him at his family's business. I went in there, and we were talking and catching up on things. And I said, do you ever think about that trip we took to Canada fishing? And he goes, yeah. I say, have you ever thought about it much? And he goes, I've spent most of my life trying to forget about what happened that day.
Wow.
And that's when I realized that Paul has never really told anybody. I've never seen Jamie since we got back from that trip, his younger brother, because I was never close to his younger brother. He's 4 years younger than us. But to this day, I always wonder what kind of impact that if Jamie was able to really get past that. I spent 6 years in the military. I served a couple of years in the 82nd Airborne and a couple of years in the 29th Infantry Regiment. And I know it, back then we didn't have a name for PTSD, but I've seen the effects that it has on people in Desert Storm. I mean, we'd been shot at and things. I know what it's like to be in those types of situations as a combat veteran, but I can tell you, I've never, ever experienced anything like I did that day in my life. I mean, I think that's why I was just so adamant about never really telling anybody. Like I say, my dad was a hunting and fishing guide. He passed away about 2 years ago, and I never told my dad about it. Even when he died, I didn't tell him about it. So I was just to the point where, as a real estate broker, as somebody who I worked in development, I had business partners, I just felt like, I had too much to lose, really, to be judged like that over something like that. But when I'm 53 now. When I turned 50 years old, I just kind of got to the point where I really didn't give a crap anymore. I mean, like I was telling you earlier, I feel like everybody's got a different threshold as far as what it's going to take for proof for them to believe in anything, whether it be Bigfoot, God, whatever, gravity. the earth being round.
Hmm.
And so when I share my account with people, and I'm happy to share it, I've reached that point where I don't feel like I'm being judged anymore. I feel like the burden of proof that you require to believe isn't my burden. That's on you. I mean, you choose when you're ready to believe, when you've seen enough evidence or whatever. I don't have that responsibility to try to make you believe when I share my encounter. So, but I think a lot of people who have had an encounter feel like that's for some reason that it's up to them to make others believe when they share this encounter, and it's not. You know, just be honest and share your life experiences, and that applies to anything, not just if you have ever had an encounter with something like this. But people will believe you if they choose to believe you, and if they don't, they don't. It's just like evidence. When I turned 50, I started doing research because at that point I was starting to circle back on life and look at things and say, I really want to learn more about what happened that day. I want to figure this thing out. And so I started educating myself and reading and watching things online, accounts, and just studying different research. And I was at a point where I could step away from my business and spend more time in the field up in northern Minnesota where I do my research. And that's when I started realizing that, there's people out there who have had encounters that just don't ever tell anybody. It's just it's a burden that they carry, never feeling. That's why I think it probably affected Jamie so badly, is because, me and Paul were 18. I was going into the Army, right? It was a new chapter for us.
Hmm.
Jamie now, as a kid who maybe wasn't really outgoing or didn't have a lot of friends or whatever, now he has to spend 4 years in high school in these halls surrounded by people that he can't tell anybody about because they'll just call him a liar. I mean, kids aren't ever going to get it, They're never going to give you the benefit of the doubt. So
for you guys, it was an adventure almost because you're going into the Army and stuff. So it was totally different than him. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Well, it was easier for us, I think, to kind of turn the page and put it behind you when you're starting something different, How do you put something behind you when you're in that point in your life where you're just doing the same thing over and over every day? So, if I thought that there was somebody who could have gave me answers to the questions I had at that point, I would have, I'd walk 100 miles to spend 5 minutes talking to somebody who could explain to me in detail why that happened to me and, all these things. After having 34 years to think about it now, I've kind of drawn some conclusions as to why it reacted the way it did, things like that. I think I have a pretty good understanding of probably what happened there, but when I was younger, it's just like I just saw something that I'd heard stories about. I never had any, like I say, I never had a reference in my life. I never was told your cousin saw one, your brother's, it's like nobody ever talked about that.
So this island, how big was it, and how far away was it from the nearest shoreline?
It was about 25 acres, maybe 25, 30 acres, between 25 and 30 acres. And it was about a third of a mile from the shoreline of the mainland, not real far.
Oh.
I mean, between this island and the mainland, there's probably more like a channel, And I honestly believe that had this encounter happened on the mainland shoreline, that creature never would have made me aware that it was even there. It would have had an infinite forest to just back into. But this is a small island, and when we showed up on it, I believe maybe it probably used the island to hunt from. I know when we were the 3 days prior to this experience, and then again once, at least 2 times after it while we were still fishing up there. There's probably 4 or 5 times total in 8 days where we had seen a deer or a moose swimming from one island to another, or from a shoreline to an island. You know, they, for whatever reason, they must stand on a shore and think the grass looks greener over there, and they start swimming. But with as common as it is, and this island being elevated the way that it was, you know, if I guess you got to think about, if you're a 10-foot tall Bigfoot that weighs 1,200 pounds, it's not easy catching a big game animal. I mean, it isn't. That it doesn't matter how fast they are. They are probably ambush hunters, you know, not stalk and chase hunters. They wait in ambush at the right points. And if you place yourself on that island, you might have to wait 2 days before it happens, but eventually there's going to be something swimming to that island, whether it's a deer, a moose, a bear. And when you, from the top of that island, when you're looking out at the main shore or at the other islands around, if you saw something swimming to the island you're on, to place yourself in the tree line at that exact spot where you know it's going to be swimming up to, and it's exhausted when it gets to the shoreline, it's not going to run far. Just to jump out and break its neck wouldn't be that hard. I mean, it really is a good technique to hunt, I guess, if you were hunting by hand. And
that's a good theory.
So I think that it probably doesn't habitate on that island. It's almost too small, especially if there's a group of them. You know, most research has shown they exist in groups. And if it has a family unit or a group, it definitely was probably too small of an island to habitate there. But, you know, if 3 or 4 of us were to line up 50 feet apart and basically do a deer drive from one end of that island to the other, you'd flush it out. I mean, where's it going to go, right? It's a small island. It's heavy forested, but it knows that it doesn't have the space to just retreat and retreat and retreat silently without running out of real estate, you know?
Yeah.
And so it made me realize 2 things. One, that maybe small islands aren't a bad spot to research, but also that, you know, how many people have encounters that don't know they had an encounter? I mean, that were in the presence of one, and because it wasn't stuck with limited options for the space, that I honestly believe this thing would have just stepped backward 100 feet and I never would have encountered it, you know? The reason why it broke the log, I think, the reason why it placed itself in the trail and let me stand right in front of it, was an attempt to say, run away. Right. I want you to leave. Run away. And at first, maybe it thought breaking this log will make him run away. And then when that didn't work, I'm coming up the trail. It's going to stand in front of me holding the log. That'll make me run away. That didn't work. I stood there for 6, 7, 8 seconds trying to stare this thing down, figuring out what it was. And then it throws the log at me. You know, it was like this tiered response, right? Yeah. Because at any time, it could have stepped. I don't know if it was behind these cedar scrubs or the 2 minutes I stood there looking for it. I don't know where it was. I still can't figure out where it was at that point. But I can tell you without any sound at all, I mean, it was still, you could hear me snap my finger from 100 feet away in that forest that day. It, wherever it was, it placed itself on that trail absolutely with dead silence. Just the stealth it had is mind-boggling. So, you know, but like I say, I mean, it could have just, at any time, it could have stepped out and just cracked me with that log like a baseball bat and killed me if it wanted to, and not given me the opportunity to see it first, or any of that, you know. I just think it wanted me to leave, you know, and I'm going to try this. And if that don't make them leave, I'm going to try this. And if that don't make them leave, I'll throw this at them. And, you know, it just got to that point.
So I know since then, and I don't think we'll have time to cover it tonight because I know it's quite elaborate, but you have started the research, and I would like to do a part two because you have had a lot of luck researching, right?
Yeah.
We've
So
got a whole other hour of research to talk about.
yeah, we could spend another episode talking about that. Like I say, I live up in northern Minnesota, and I have a home in South Dakota, but I've started spending some time researching up in northern Minnesota, and a well-known researcher, Doug Hajicek, lives very close to me. We've become friends in our research, sharing ideas, and he's had some really interesting things he's been unfolding right now with.
Oh yeah.
He's got a system of 9 cameras that are powered at all times on a property that's highly active, and it's just he's in the process of using that site to leverage a Legend Meet Science 2 that's going to be
that's coming up.
It's going to start in production very soon, and so I've been working. I'm not far from that property, and I've got a property that is also highly active that we've been collecting DNA samples on and stuff. And I'd be happy to come back and talk about that more.
Yeah, let's do that. I would even as soon as possible. So I really want to hear about that. I mean,
well, Doug speaks highly of you.
Really?
I let Doug know on Messenger. I said, "Hey, do you know Cornell?" He asked me to come on and show you. He goes, "Oh, I like that guy." He says, "I really like that guy." He goes, "Do his show. Go talk to him." So, and I know Doug would even be happy to join us too and talk. If I don't know if there's a way to put all 3 of us here.
Oh yeah, there is. But he's so approachable.
Oh yeah, I know that if we just tell him, hey, look, next week on Sunday, let's get on there together, and because it is relative. Yeah. The research he's doing, the research I'm doing, there are differences, and we've orchestrated it that way so that we can, in the proof of one research technique he's using working actually proves mine in a different way. And so it's really tied together kind of how we're doing this. But it's just crazy how some of the results are so we've tied a couple elements. I won't spoil it, but I have a background in I had a couple companies that I owned that dealt with ultraviolet light and black light technology and fluorescent colors. A lot of studying that I did with this. And Doug, through his thousands of hours of bear research, he was one of the first ones to ever put cameras in a bear den and film the birth of bears in a den and how they react in a den. And through all the study, he says, I keep running into the same thing, the color blue. I find blue things. They stash blue things.
Really?
It's just like they can see this better. And we started talking about how caribou see in UV. Scientists have, and the scientific community has accepted the fact that caribou see in UV. It's a different light spectrum they see in than us and most all animals. But he said, I believe bears perhaps see in UV. Well, the chances of us talking at 1 a.m. on Messenger about this, and then I say, oh, by the way, I'm an expert with UV light. We started really leveraging what that means. Like if bears could see in it, and possibly the relation, maybe Bigfoot could see in it, what would that look like? And what would that explain? And that's where we've taken our research into trying to figure out if there's a connection in that. And so far, the results are pretty crazy. I mean, just the things that I have a real low-tech research going on, meaning it's tiered. I'm visiting the same site every week for 20 weeks, and I'm in week 15 right now. I go in on a Thursday, I leave items, I come back on a Friday, collect them, try to get DNA off of them. But the items I leave have grown and evolved each week. And they're all tied to the color of a fluorescent blue in some way. I've got these creatures understanding that when they see fluorescent blue, whether it's a ribbon around a tree or whether it's the lid on a jar or whether it's a game camera that the whole thing's painted fluorescent blue with no batteries in it, it's just laying there, that there's also a reward there. There's polished rocks and there's candy. I mean, so it's starting to accustom blue with reward. And Doug, what he's doing is he's really getting neat results in that he has peanut butter jars that not only get unscrewed and then all the stuff eaten out of them, it looks like he ran it through a dishwasher.
Yeah.
And the lids are oftentimes screwed back on.
Wow.
So it's just, yeah, some of the research you're doing, it's as we share some of these results that we've had, it just will, it's just story after story of things that have happened. And, you know, a lot of times I'll say to him, I'm having a problem. I don't get why they take this, but I don't know if I got to be able to prove it's Bigfoot, right? This was removed. How do I know? I was leaving pieces of Biddle honey candy, you know, the I don't know if you're familiar with Biddle honey. It's kind of a mapley honey flavored taffy kind. And I'd take these little bite-sized ones and unwrap them and leave them where I had fluorescent blue flagging tape, and they'd always be gone. And I said, how do I know it's not a bear or a squirrel or something? He goes, put it in a baby food jar and put the lid on it. And I started doing that, and the lid's always off of them. And a lot of times the lid's screwed back on afterwards. So just crazy results that we're getting. So,
wow, let's see if we can get him on with you then, maybe next Sunday.
Yeah, I think he'd enjoy that.
Could you speak to him and then I can put a post up?
Actually, he might be. I don't know if you can see your viewers right now, but
he said there's a way to do it, but I cannot.
I told him I'm going to be on your show tonight, and he said, "Yeah, I'm planning on being at home." He says, "I'll watch." So maybe if you're watching, Doug, you have an invite to join us next week, Sunday night. But I'll be messaging him tonight. So
awesome. Well, thanks very much for coming on.
Get him on.
That story was fantastic. That's probably one of the more unique stories I've heard. That was and very well told. Also, that was amazing.
Yeah. Well, I've had different people ask me, you know, do you think, like, when your ankle stopped hurting, do you think you were like healed by Bigfoot, you know? And the one thing I didn't mention here in this is that night I pulled my shirt up and my left hip had a scrape going down my hip and leg the size of your handprint. And my stomach looked like you had swung a baseball bat at me as hard as you can. I mean, I was black and blue across my stomach. So, you know, would Bigfoot have healed my ankle and not healed the other injuries I sustained? I don't think that's likely, you know. But I will say that Intuit guide that stood there, you know, and I, being from South Dakota, I've got a lot of friends who are Native American and, you know, who have grown up in these rural areas in the outdoors. And you know, that spiritual connection that those people have to those surroundings that they grew up in. I think when I say I felt like he was reading right through me, like, I think that because he had an experience. And here's the other thing. When he said he said, my experience happened close to Patton Island, but it was on the island to the west of it, which was the island we were on.
Wow.
I told him it was Patton Island because I didn't know the name of the little island to the west of it. So this happened 8 months earlier to him on that same island we were on. So you know, there's a good chance that this was the same individual, you know. But the fact that he just saw me standing there and I was doing nothing but just being quiet, for him to just, I think he had just this experience where he just connected in some spiritual way that he just knew that this person has gone through what I had gone through, or that had a connection to something that I did, you know, because he wasn't shy about it, you know. And when he told me what had happened and shared his account with me, I mean, it definitely made me feel like I wasn't going insane, so to speak. Like, I mean, just so thankful that this has happened to somebody besides me, you know.
And there's got to be others too. There's got to be other people that have pulled up on that island and went fishing or something.
Yeah, you know, like I say, it's a really remote area, but there's no way in heck I'm the first person that's ever been there. Not to mention in that area, I mean, BFRO's registry, when you look in Manitoba, I mean, there's only like 13 encounters or something crazy like that for the whole province. I mean,
yeah,
come on. The place is so remote and so you know, off the grid that you know, there's people that have had experiences, and because of how remote it is, a lot of these experiences happen to people who are just one or two people. They're experiencing it, and the likelihood of one or two people carrying that burden and not telling anybody versus, let's say, a group of 7 people saw it, you know,
yeah,
7 people are going to tell the world.
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah, I appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to talking next week. It'll be fun.
All right. Well, Jeff, I will talk to you. Well, we'll figure it out, but next Sunday anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm available whatever time works. Maybe we'll work around Doug's schedule a little bit, see when he's available.
We might have to.
He's a busy guy, you know.
Oh, he is. He never stops.
Yeah.
All right, man.
All right.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
See you guys.